Good morning, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the Center for Comparative and Public Law to this morning's roundtable discussion on Article 25. As many of you know, this issue of public nominations and the question of the right to stand for election with respect to the upcoming election reform exercise in Hong Kong has attracted a great deal of public interest. As you may also note from all the commentaries that we've seen in the press and generally elsewhere in public discussions, most of the discussion has focused on the terms of the Basic Law and the compatibility of various proposals in light of the Hong Kong Basic Law. One of the things that has been absent from this particular debate has been the question of how the obligations of the Hong Kong SAR government with respect to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights fits into this particular discourse. And that really is the aim of today's academic roundtable discussion. We're very, very honored to have a team of international and local experts with us today from a range of jurisdictions who have come here to make their submissions and offer some insights into the content and meaning of Article 25, which sets the tone for the kinds of provisions that we could be looking at in the context of our own election law reform exercise. And it is with a view to raise public awareness and to educate the public further on this additional dimension that has thus far been absent from the public discourse that we are seeking to have this meeting. And we hope very much that by the end of today, we could come up with some guiding principles that will help the public to evaluate the forthcoming proposals which continue to flow in terms of what should Hong Kong's democratic reform look like going forward in 2017 and beyond. So with that, I'm very, very honored to introduce to you our moderator for the day, Professor Yash Gai. He's no stranger to Hong Kong. He's been extremely public and prominent over the course of the last few decades, given his extensive work, firstly, as a member of the law faculty, of which he continues to be Professor Emeritus, and of course more extensively in terms of his international role on various election law commissions, where he has served as a rapporteur or provided his expertise with respect to the development of constitutional assemblies and election committees around the world. So please join me in welcoming Professor Yash Gai and opening the roundtable officially.
Thank you very much, Pooja. It's a great pleasure to come back to the university and this gorgeous building that the law faculty has managed to erect. It's also a great pleasure to see so many familiar faces, and I hope to meet them over coffee break and tea break. We have very limited time today, and I want to get straight into the business of the day. I want to find time for as many of you as you want to make your contribution. So I'm going to be strict with myself, and I'm going to be strict with the experts from overseas who will be the panel for the first session. So let me start straight away. First, perhaps we should introduce ourselves, the experts who have come from abroad and may not be known to everyone, though I guess most of these are household names. So perhaps we could start from here. Professor All, if you could just briefly introduce yourself in 1 minute.
Just one matter of housekeeping. You'll need to press the button in front of you so that the red light comes on and direct the mic closer to your self. Perfect.
So I'm Professor Graham Orr from the University of Queensland, where I spent 17 years studying election law. And I'm also on a journal called the Election Law Journal with my friend here, Professor Gronke.
Thank you.
My name is Paul Gronke. I teach at Reed College, which is a small liberal arts college in Portland, Oregon. I don't think it's actually cold here. I think the weather's nice and warm and toasty. I brought my swimming suit, so thank you very much for inviting me. And I am the editor of the Election Law Journal, which is a interdisciplinary journal of law, policy, and political science dealing with electoral law issues. So I'm happy to speak with any interested parties about that. My own work, I've been working for most of my career on American elections primarily. For the last decade on election administration issues arising in the United States after the kind of debacle of 2000. My work has been increasingly internationalizing because of questions over election conduct and election integrity. I actually hope to see my friend Graham in September at the Australian Political Science Association meeting, which someone may be familiar with. I think there's going to be a lot of discussions and papers delivered at that meeting on election conduct and election integrity. Thanks.
Thank you.
Simon Young. I'm a teacher in the Faculty of Law here at Hong Kong U. I'm also running the Design Democracy Hong Kong project, which is an online platform to promote public discussion and debate on electoral and constitutional reform.
Carol, please.
Constitutional law and was also one of the directors of the CCPL at one point. I'm currently a professor of law at the William S. Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii, and I'm also director of the Matsunaga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, which has a graduate program in conflict resolution and specializes in trying to train graduate students how to facilitate controversial issues in the public. Thank you.
Professor Foss. Okay.
Good morning. I'm P.Y. Low. I'm a member of the Hong Kong Bar. I've been in practice for about 20 years. I do quite a bit of judicial review work, and I've been for quite some time a member of the Bar Council and also the chairman of the Special Committee on Constitutional Affairs and Human Rights. Also, I've written quite a bit about the Hong Kong Basic Law. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Christopher Forsyth. I'm Professor of Public Law in the University of Cambridge. My primary interest is in judicial review, in all aspects of judicial review, but I've done quite a lot of work, including advising and consulting with governments on constitutional reform of many kinds.
Good morning. I'm Kelly Loper. I'm the director of the LLM and Human Rights program in the law faculty here at Hong Kong U, and I'm also the deputy director of the Center for Comparative and Public Law. My research focuses on the implementation of international human rights standards in domestic contexts, including and especially in Hong Kong. And I've conducted research projects focusing on equality and non-discrimination and also the protection of refugees.
We can start with,
Okay, there it goes. Yeah, Michael Davis, I'm on the Faculty of Law here at Hong Kong U, where I teach courses on comparative constitutional law and human rights. I guess I could say I first became directly involved with the issue we're confronting today years ago when I was with Ronnie Tong and others and Johannes Chan in the Article 23 and then 45 Concern Group, where we directly debated these issues. And I think first started thinking about exactly this issue of nomination. So look forward to our discussion today.
Good morning. My name is Zhu Guobin from City University of Hong Kong. Basically, I teach and research in the field of comparative law, Hong Kong basic law, and comparative constitutionalism and human rights. Thank you.
I'm H.P. Lee from the Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. I teach Australian constitutional law and Australian administrative law. Thank you.
Yes, good morning. Lin Fan from the School of Law of City University of Hong Kong. And my research area is mainly Chinese and comparative constitutional and administrative law. So the interaction between the Chinese law and the Hong Kong common law system is one of my special interests. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Pooja Kapai. I'm the director of the Center for Comparative and Public Law. I also teach here at the Faculty of Law. I teach the course on Hong Kong legal systems and multiculturalism and the law, and my area of research focuses on minority rights in international and comparative contexts, including Hong Kong. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. We now start the objective of the first session, as Pooja mentioned, is to look at the implications of Article 25 of the ICCPR, an article which is part of the constitutional law of Hong Kong. And the first point I want to make is that as I read the documents for this roundtable, I was very struck by two somewhat competing paradigms as about elections. The paradigm of the basic law, which is specific on some parts and a bit vague on others, and the paradigm of Article 25. And there does seem to be some clash on various points between the two paradigms. And I suppose one challenge of this roundtable is, are there ways in which the two models can be reconciled? If they cannot be reconciled on a particular point, which prevails, the set of rules that have developed under Article 25 or the specific provisions of the basic law? But I hope that there is a way of harmonizing, reconciling the two different set of rules, and something we shall turn to in some detail in the second session of this roundtable. The first point I would therefore like to make is that the notion of or the underlying implicit principle of Article 25 is that all people are ready for democracy. And there's no training period or historical period when people are inducted into the doctrines and practices of democracy. Whereas the underlying assumption of the basic law is that people of Hong Kong, however well-educated they are, however sophisticated they are not quite ready for independence. And therefore, this must be a gradual process. So this is a very striking difference of approach in the two paradigms. Many papers have explored the conflicts between the two models, and some have given preference to Article 25, and some have given preference to the basic law. And I hope that before we end our roundtable today, we will have produced some suggestions for the way in which the two can be harmonized. So let me just say a very few words about Article 25, and then maybe indicate very briefly what I see is the broad consensus among those who prepared papers, particularly, I guess, prepared by people from overseas with the international perspective. The first point, I suppose, is that Article 25 started rather modest life with very sparse words, but due to various interpretations, particularly the commentary on the Article 25 by the United Nations Human Rights Committee, the scope of Article 25 has expanded a great deal. And it is also, of course, important, and that was the case from the very beginning, that Article 25 should be seen in the overall context of the ICCPR. So it sets out some rules about the electoral process, but those rules have to be understood, appreciated within the broader framework of the ICCPR, which is a framework of civil and political rights in general. I don't intend really to go through the features of Article 25, but I thought it might be useful if I just touch on it briefly. Article 25 itself talks of the rights of every citizen and their right to take part in the conduct of public affairs directly or through freely chosen representatives. So participation is a very strong theme of the rules that have evolved from Article 25. The second part is that it is a right to vote and to be elected at genuine elections periodically. So it's both the right to vote and the right to be a candidate. The article guarantees that voting will be by universal and equal suffrage and would be by secret ballot so that it can give expression to the will of the people. This was then taken up by the Human Rights Committee and elaborated and clarified. And the principal conditions under the article as set out in the general comment is that there should be no distinction in relation either to vote or to be a candidate as between citizens. Any conditions that might need to be imposed on this general rule of no distinctions, and the distinctions referred to are set out in, I think, Article 2 of the ICCPR, which has these normal factors of gender and race and religion and so on. So any restrictions that might be applied to this broad principle should be based on objective and reasonable criteria. And there is now much learning, much jurisprudence on what is objective and reasonable. And a number of papers have looked at case law from a number of jurisdictions from that point of view. It's also implicit that there's a higher requirement for the right to vote than for the right to be a candidate. There is to be no discrimination between citizens, and I mentioned that point. There are strong emphasis that the voters will have the right to have free choice of candidates. And if there is to be some restriction, then it must be justifiable. Some are very obvious about age, about residence, about citizenship. Others are, as we know now, at least they're a bit more problematic. So certain factors, exclusionary factors, are identified in the report, in the comment. Others have to be worked out from the broad context of the situation. There's also been some discussion, and the comment picks that up, as to whether it's valid to restrict the right to be a candidate only to members of political parties or nominees of political parties. Some have regarded that as, in certain circumstances, acceptable. Other jurisdictions, the answer is no. It's the right of individuals. And finally, the point which has been often noted is that the Article 25 does not prescribe any particular electoral or political system, and so there's a limit of the reach of the electoral of the Article 25 when it comes to how a country structures its system of governance. Article 25 has been used now not only by the Human Rights Commission, but by a number of international, regional, national institutions to develop their system of elections. But I think if we just stick to these principal points that I have mentioned, we can probably deal with most issues that might arise in Hong Kong. I'm glad to say that there seems to be considerable agreement among the experts, as we are called, who have contributed papers for the roundtable. Incidentally, if you haven't seen these papers, which are all extremely interesting, and some by people who couldn't unfortunately be with us, they are available online, and you can get more details from the center. I certainly would recommend strongly that you have a look at them. The broad consensus, I think, among the paper writers is, of course, that Article 25 covers only some aspects of elections and not all. And in these other areas, perhaps there is some discretion that a state can exercise. There's also a very substantial agreement that that there is a lot of flexibility in the rules set out in Article 25. The whole notion of objective and reasonable restrictions implies that there can be departures in some respects from the rules as set out in the article and as elaborated in the general comment. Several papers have looked at the ways in which, even operating within Article 25, it is possible to accommodate the provisions of the Basic Law or the terms set out by the People's Republic as to reform the future development of the electoral system. Of course, there are certain provisions which are set out in the Basic Law itself, and not just in the annexes, as to some essential conditions for being chief executive of Hong Kong. And we perhaps will come to that later. There's also broad consensus, I think, on what are the issues that arise from the implementation of the Basic Law and what challenges they pose and how they might be seen to be incompatible with Article 25, at least at first sight. number of papers have emphasized the importance of people's participation, both as a voter and as a candidate. I think most people have taken the position that a nominating committee for candidates for the chief executive is compatible with Article 25, but whether or not it is in terms of the rules that are developed for nomination would depend on the broad framework of Article 25, particularly as elaborated by the Commission. And I think much of our discussion today, I expect, will be on not so much on the validity of a commission or a committee which is set up expressly for the purpose of nominating candidates as to its composition, its precise powers, precise qualifications that might be imposed on candidacy for chief executive. And I'm sure much of our discussion will revolve around these questions. There's another issue which has not been canvassed very much in the papers, except by one or two papers, and that is what is the role of the PRC government in this process, and in particular, apart from laying the general interpretations of the basic law, there's the question of the appointment of the chief executive, which is defined as the responsibilities of the people's government in Beijing. What is the significance of that particular provision? What scope does it give for the people's government in setting the criteria for candidacy, and in particular whether this provision that the appointment is by the people's government gives the government a veto. I raise that because it hasn't been discussed much in the papers, but it does raise a very fundamental question about the relationship of Hong Kong with the people's government. Very often, constitutions do provide for appointments by the head of state, for example, in parliamentary systems, particularly where the role of the head of state is a very formal role without vesting the head of state with any discretion. So the question is this provision about the appointment by the people's government a mere formality, and they are bound by the decisions that the people of Hong Kong would have made through the elections, or can it override the will of the people of Hong Kong? I think one paper takes the line that indeed there's a veto, others haven't touched on it. My own view is to argue that Beijing has a veto over the people's will here would be a complete negation of Article 25, and it's best seen as a kind of formality, but that is something I think for us to discuss. I don't want to say very much more about the general thrust of the papers. I'm going to ask each of the panelists for this session if they would want to mention a rule of the Article 25, which has a special relevance for Hong Kong, or to say that within the broad framework of Article 25, what kind of procedures, rules would be incompatible if they were adopted for the forthcoming elections. And any other point they really want to make related to the framework of Article 25. Because the purpose of this first session is to acquaint ourselves with the broad framework that is implicit and sometimes explicit in Article 25, which has been accepted universally as the standard for democratic elections. And so the focus, I think, should be on what are the implications of Article 25, particularly in the context of Hong Kong. But we will have more time in the second session to discuss the adaptability of the general comment, for example, to the circumstances of Hong Kong. So the detailed discussion of that we shall take up in the second session. So with that, perhaps I can just go in the order that you introduce yourself. Remember that I don't expect very long presentations by you at this stage because most people have had the benefit, have had access to your papers, and hopefully they remember what you said. But if there are some specific points that you want to raise about the framework of Article 25, this is the time to do it. Professor.
Thank you, Yash. Yes, I think the most salient thing about Article 25 is that it is explicitly written as rights and opportunities of every citizen. Every citizen shall have the right and opportunity to vote and to be elected at genuine periodic elections. Now, there are other ways of thinking about electoral law, most notably a structural approach, one that focuses on fair competition. But international law is focusing on a question of individual or guarantee of individual rights. Now, my conclusion from this is that this requires the ability to nominate from civil society. If you don't have a political party system for the election of your chief executive, that therefore requires an ability to nominate oneself subject to a level of popular support in, for instance, getting a petition of nominators together. That doesn't mean you can't have a nominating committee, but the nominating committee's democratic role is to augment choice by ensuring that worthy candidates who may not otherwise or immediately have a mobilised popular support can still appear on the ballot paper. But it seems to me that, on the whole, the nomination committee that's often assumed here is going to play a largely exclusionary role. And if it plays an exclusionary role, then it can't guarantee the individual opportunity to seek to stand, which the international article seeks to guarantee. So my conclusion is that you have to have a nomination committee, but you have to have alongside it some process for civil nominations as well, or otherwise you won't be compliant with Article 25.
Thank you. Professor Kunke.
Yeah, you push it in and you have to push it out again. Again, thank you. I have lots of thoughts on this. I was reviewing my own submission, and I don't want to be repetitive because, as you noted, a number of us have come to some consensus about what the expectations are of Article 25 and how those could be implemented. My own view here is that a lot of the political theory or democratic theory that's referred to in a number of the proposals was written at a time historically where there was certain reliance on certain political and social institutions that were already in place. And I'm really here to learn today as much as I am to educate. I feel like I'm learning a lot, and it's not clear to me how much of those prior political institutions and social institutions are already in place in this polity. And so I'm going to have to learn that. And I literally mean there's references in a number of the proposals to ideal democratic structures, and I'm a pragmatist. I don't know what those are. So I'll have to hear about what the expectations are. The other part of political theory, I would say, that is not really reflected in a lot of these proposals is what I would call modern democratic political theory that is stemming from economic analyses such as Kenneth Arrow. And so some of the proposals that I've discussed in my commentary are not realistic from Arrovian considerations. That is, according to Arrow, there is no pure democratic system that's going to operate in any kind of coherent and rational way. And so some sort of restrictions are necessary. And that actually bridges over to something that I think Carol, who I just met this morning, it turns out a fellow alumni of the University of Chicago, commented on in her own written commentary, and that is some of these proposals ask for tens of thousands of nomination signatures. Well, those sound nice in principle. In practice, that's going to be impossible. It's going to be impossible to certify tens of thousands of signatures. I guess I move both from the area of theory. I like to talk about democratic theory, but this is very practical. This is very grounded. So I think we have to keep in mind when we're talking just grand theory to the very grounded practical aspects of how this is going to be put in place. The second question I have, or what I need to learn more about, is what are the kind of prior expectations, the foundations of launching a political system in this way? What do we expect in terms of social and political conditions, and are those in place? And the last really would be practical. How is this practically going to be implemented in the short period of time? The only last thing I'll say is we're at a law school and there's a lot of lawyers in the room. I'm a political scientist, not a lawyer. And when I look at things like reasonable as a criteria, that just feels to me like a lot of lawyers are going to be fighting about that. So, and as Professor Guy said initially, teaching his law students about how to interpret these terms, yeah, that strikes me as space for litigation, I would say in the American context.
I want to begin by apologizing that I don't have a paper. You won't be able to find my paper online. So I'll just use this opportunity to make a few short points. First point is something that wasn't mentioned in Professor Guy's introduction, which I think is very important to mention, but only to set aside, right? Because this is something that I think some of the government and former government officials may have mentioned in this context of Article 25, but I don't think it's relevant. And it is, of course, the reservation to Article 25. Because when you look at our basic law, in Article 39 of the basic law, it refers to the ICCPR as applied to Hong Kong. And we now know from the Court of Final Appeal that as applied to Hong Kong is, of course, plus the reservation. So one has to take that into account in the Hong Kong context. And the reservation I'm talking about is the one that says Article 21, which is Article 25 of the ICCPR, does not require the establishment of an elected executive or legislative council in Hong Kong. Notice it doesn't say an elected chief executive. It talks about an executive council and legislative council. So that's why I say that we can set that aside, and because it's not relevant at all to our current debate. Of course, it may be relevant to the LegCo debate, but of course we have case law which has said, when they interpret this reservation, if you already have an elected LegCo, whatever form that may be, this reservation is irrelevant. All right, so I just want to sort of set that aside, just in case anyone might want to think about invoking that reservation. The second point I want to make is, and it's partly perhaps a critique about the whole exercise of today in terms of also the way the questions are formulated. Because if you look at the questions for our exercise today, they often ask in terms of, does Article 25 require this or require that? And I think there's a danger in trying to come up with a kind of a strict interpretation of these articles. Because at the end of the day, we're not doing adjudication here. We're not arguing a case before a court. It's not important to come to a strict interpretation. In fact, there's a danger because we may say as experts, oh, it may not require this, and that could be perhaps used against us. Oh, even these experts don't say it requires this, we can brush it aside. I don't think that's the proper way of looking at these instruments. These instruments contain not just rights, but they contain fundamental values, right? think back in the debate, the election of the chief executive in 2012 referenced the core values. Right? What are the core values of Hong Kong? Well, you find them in our constitutional instruments. Right? So, for example, of Article 25, my favorite provision, of course, really is paragraph A, right? Because I think it's A that speaks to the issue of nomination. Right? The fact that people have a right to take part in the conduct of public affairs. This notion, this value of participation, right? Directly or indirectly through freely chosen, right? Freely chosen representatives. And also in B, I also like the words, guaranteeing the free expression of the will of the electors, right? I think those are very important words to keep in mind because they represent values. And of course, I mean, these instruments also give us baselines for which to test restrictions. And that's my next point, is the point about unreasonable restrictions. I was involved in a case which had to interpret this word unreasonable restriction in the context of prisoners' right to vote. I happen to be on the losing side of this case. This is a case where the court struck down our restrictions on prisoners' right to vote because they're unreasonable. We had very broad blanket restrictions on prisoners, not only on their right to vote, but also the right to register to vote, which really didn't make a lot of sense because you could be leaving jail tomorrow, but you couldn't have registered, so you couldn't vote even if the election was tomorrow. So that whole experience impressed upon me the importance of being able to articulate very clear justifications based on rationality and proportionality, because that is the test that the court applied, but having that in very clear, having an evidential basis to support this, right? So in our discussion, I think we should keep that in mind, that if there's any sort of discussion about things that may impinge on not just these rights, but the values in Article 25, we look very closely as what is the reason? Why do we have to have that restriction? And lastly, I just want to mention the veto, which Yash had brought up. I take a slightly less pessimistic view. I think Article 25 has to be read, of course, in the context of Hong Kong. And of course, Hong Kong with its autonomy structure. And it raises interesting questions about how an article like this applies in the context of autonomy, where the autonomy has a very high degree of autonomy. So, I mean, I'm prepared to accept that there can be compatibility with the veto and the article, but the question is, how do we address the concerns that the mainland might have? And I think there could be very serious concerns about electing a candidate that is not acceptable to Beijing, or that there is this sort of conflict in the selection of candidates. Because of course that just doesn't give rise to good governance if you were in that situation. And I think the question is, how do you respond to that? And there's two ways to respond to this. One is the way which seems to be coming from the north, which is that we have to ensure that our system prevents this absolutely. So you have to have a nomination system that guarantees that there's going to be no conflict right from the very beginning, right? Hence this idea of screening, right? But the other response to it, which is I think what is reflected in the values of Article 25, is the idea that yes, there may be conflict, but let these conflicts sort of play themselves out in the electoral process, right? Because it could well be, right, that the public, in their wisdom, they see that this is a candidate that's not going to be acceptable in Beijing. It may well be that may influence both the vote, and it also may well be that someone initially may appear not to be acceptable to Beijing, turns out through the electoral process becomes acceptable, right? i.e. 2012 chief executive election. Thank you.
Thank you very much. P. White, do you want to say something?
Thank you, Yash. At first, I wanted to say something about jurisprudence, or local jurisprudence. It seems that Simon has already said about it. Maybe what try to remember is about the veto. The joint declaration sets out the basic policies of the PRC towards Hong Kong. And these are the basic policies that are supposed to be unchangeable under the basic law. And I think one of the basic policies refers to, of course, Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong, but also that the chief executive would be appointed with the reference or on the basis of, not very, at the moment, not using the exact words of the election results. So if one places some importance on the basic policies, you will find you might be able to say that the veto that has been put forward by the as part of the process of getting a chief executive installed in Hong Kong may be closer to a formality than what has been what's been told to us. Another point that I might wish to draw is that, of course, Article 25 of the ICCPR provides for a very broad framework, but then there is concern here that I've highlighted in my paper that the Human Rights Committee has said that paragraph A of 25 cannot be understood as meaning that any directly affected group, large or small, has the unconditional right to choose the modality of participation in the conduct of public affairs. That, in fact, would be an extrapolation of right to direct participation of citizens far beyond the scope of Article 25A, which speaks about election for representatives. So I just wonder whether this particular part of the jurisprudence of the Human Rights Committee might offer justification for having a nominating committee. Of course, this is only part of the picture, and since we are talking about a nominating committee which has to work within the framework of the Basic Law, which includes Article 26 of the Basic Law, that guarantees the right to vote and the right to be elected of Hong Kong permanent residents, as well as Article 25 of the ICCPR. Then we will have this framework of the nominating committee to be filled up by rules that hopefully from the guiding principles that we might be able to develop today be compatible with both the Basic Law, its guarantee of fundamental rights, as well as the more specific, albeit written in 1966, the more specific rules or the ideas and values that is contained in the Article 25 of the ICCPR. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by saying I agree with Simon on the reservation. I won't add anything more on it, but I think he's absolutely right. I also agree with what Yash said in the beginning, that we need to find a way to rationalize and harmonize the requirements of ICCPR Article 25 and the Basic Law. And I do think that we can do that. I think we have to do that, because this is not just an academic discussion. This is a matter of urgency for Hong Kong, because in the current system, Hong Kong is rapidly becoming ungovernable. I would never want to be the chief executive of this territory under the current system. It's impossible to govern if you don't have a public mandate now. An appointed governor could govern in the colonial era because then we had an appointed legislative council, but that's not the case anymore. The Legislative Council is far more representative of the public. and the chief executive must have a public mandate as well. If not, Hong Kong, I think, is going to fall apart. So this is a matter of urgency. I do think it's possible to design a nomination committee and a nomination procedure that is compatible with the ICCR and also compatible with the Basic Law. The key points for me are, number one, that nominating committee needs to be broadly representative, and by that I mean it has to give rough parity to the views of everyone in Hong Kong. I'm aware that we still have functional constituencies in the Legislative Council, but I wouldn't want to go beyond that in terms of institutionalizing the influence, especially of corporate voting. So if that concept of corporate voting is going to remain in the system at all, I think it should be reflected through participation by the functional constituency representatives of the Legislative Council in the nominating committee. I do not think we should try to preserve any other form of corporate voting in this nomination system. I can see the point of including the functional constituency representatives as well as the other legislative councilors in the nominating committee, because one of my concerns about the governability of Hong Kong is that the chief executive needs support from the Legislative Council. And so I think there could be some value in that. But I do think any new way of preserving corporate voting should be avoided at all costs, because I think it takes away the legitimacy of the entire process. The second thing that I think is essential is that the Hong Kong people need to know that if there is a very popular candidate who meets the requirements of Article 44 of the Basic Law, then they will have the opportunity to vote for that candidate. Article 44 sets forth certain eligibility requirements regarding the age of the chief executive, the fact that the chief executive cannot have right of abode elsewhere and must have resided in the territory for a certain number of years. Any nomination procedure that tries to add new eligibility requirements would, in my opinion, not only violate Article 25 of the ICCPR, but it's unconstitutional. Because if we were going to put extra eligibility requirements for the chief executive, then they should have been put into the draft Basic Law, and the people should have had the opportunity to comment on that when the Basic Law was being drafted. Moreover, if the nomination process is used to screen out someone, the people will see that as a sham. People know who's popular and who would have a chance of being elected. If they don't get the opportunity to vote for that person, then, God protect the new chief executive, because that new chief executive will have no more legitimacy than the current chief executive has. And the governability problems will persist and become worse because the people will feel cheated. They were promised universal suffrage. If they don't get the chance to vote for the person they really want, they will feel cheated. So I think it's very important that the nomination committee and the nomination process be constructed in a way that there is equal suffrage and an opportunity to have a genuine choice of candidates. Finally, I'd like to say something about the veto process. I did not address that in my paper because we are focusing on the nomination process. But my feeling is that regardless of whether it's viewed as a mere formality or as a genuine right by the central government to veto a particular candidate at the final stage, I think it would be wrong to try to bury a veto power in the nomination process. That I strongly object to. If the power to appoint is interpreted as giving the central government the right to say no, then let the central government say no openly at the final stage and explain its reasons for denying the people their choice. It would be totally wrong to say that because they have a final power at the end to appoint, that we should work in some kind of screening into the nomination process to make sure that they don't have to exercise that power. That's just being dishonest and disingenuous. If the central government wants to veto someone and the NPC Standing Committee interprets their power to allow them to do so, then do it openly and explain the reasons. The nomination process should not be used as a way to screen out someone who meets the requirements of Article 44. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Forsyth.
Well, I'd like to start by saying that I agree with Professor Peterson that the securing of some kind of popular mandate for the chief executive is an urgent matter in Hong Kong and goes to the heart of the stability of Hong Kong. But I wouldn't necessarily follow all the rest of the way down her other arguments. I think the prospect of Chinese people government's veto of the chief executive who enjoys popular support would be so profoundly bad for the government of Hong Kong and for the general stability of Hong Kong, that is a consequence that one must try at all hands to avoid, even if it requires a measure of compromise on the applicability of Article 25. Now, what I'd say about Article 25, I understand this first session is primarily addressing the question number one, the extent to which nomination procedures are compatible with Article 25. What I'd say about Article 25 is, of course, as Professor Guy mentioned at the beginning, that the rights of Article 25 are subject to reasonable restriction. And the point that I would make at this stage is that the unique constitutional position of Hong Kong is relevant to that question of whether a restriction is reasonable or not. And one of those unique constitutional aspects that has already been mentioned is the fact that the chief executive is not only accountable to the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, by which I understand the people of Hong Kong, but is also accountable to the Central People's Government. And you may think that that is a measure of intellectual incoherence in the role of the chief executive, and it's one of the reasons why I think the role of the chief executive is so difficult in Hong Kong. But it has to be an element within our discussions. And so the constitutional situation in Hong Kong is crucial in determining what restrictions are reasonable into the Article 25 debate. I think I'd just end by saying that having suggested that there might be quite substantial restrictions to Article 25 rights in the interests of constitutional development and stability in Hong Kong, I must say that, of course, any restriction on Article 25 that denied the genuine will, any restriction in the constitutional law of Hong Kong that denied the general will of the Hong Kong people, that frustrated that, must be a breach of Article 25 and is profoundly to be deprecated. Whether we can quite square those circles remains to be seen in the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was asked by the organizers to focus in particular on the requirement that any election procedures, including nomination procedures, comply with equality and non-discrimination provisions in the ICCPR. And it's clear from the language of Article 25 that there is a requirement that any election processes, nomination procedures, do comply with equality and non-discrimination. And I would also reinforce Yasha's point that he made at the very beginning, that we really do need to read Article 25 in the context of the ICCPR as a whole, and in particular with reference to Article 2, which is a general obligation on states to ensure the enjoyment of all human rights in the ICCPR, including Article 25, without discrimination. And this is mentioned again explicitly in Article 25. And also Article 26, which is a freestanding right to equality and non-discrimination. So anything that the Hong Kong government does should be non-discriminatory. And I think that this is really important because it also opens up the jurisprudence and the interpretations of the Human Rights Committee on what equality and non-discrimination means, what it requires in all contexts. And I think we can rely on that jurisprudence when developing our principles in relation to the reading of Article 25. And in particular, I mean, I go into this in a bit of detail in my paper, summarize the jurisprudence of the Human Rights Committee and other human rights treaty bodies about the meaning of equality and non-discrimination. But I think it's important to note in this context and with relation to the Hong Kong procedures that non-discrimination includes, or the meaning of discrimination includes not only direct formal distinctions that exclude certain groups based on political opinion or sex or gender or race or whatever, but also indirect discrimination. So we need to be very careful that whatever model comes out of this process in the end does not indirectly discriminate on the basis of any of those grounds. And I think there's great danger that the preservation of corporate voting systems or any system nomination process that gives greater emphasis to the voices of particular sectors, particular industries, probably does, and the CEDAW committee, which is something I point out in my paper, has commented that it probably does discriminate against women, for example, but also could serve as a means of excluding the voices of particular political parties. And I think that this focus and emphasis that I'm making on ensuring non-discrimination, including in an indirect way, goes to Carol's point about legitimacy. I think any system that discriminates undermines the legitimacy of the whole process and the legitimacy of the candidates and ultimately the chief executive's ability to govern Hong Kong. So I think that this is, it's not an academic point. It's actually very important to bear in mind that the nomination procedure must comply with the non-discrimination provisions in the ICCPR and not just in Article 25. So there's the legitimacy point. And I also, to Yash's earlier point about harmonization between the basic law and Article 25 and the ICCPR more broadly, maybe one small point to consider is that we should be, or a principle that we might want to adopt, is that we should be interpreting the term broadly representative nominating committee in the basic law with reference to the equality and non-discrimination provisions in the ICCPR. So in other words, broadly representative should mean non-discrimination. And I have a lot more to say, but I think I'll leave it at that for now, and I'm happy to raise other points related to this particular aspect of the discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Lin?
Yes, thanks. I just want to engage a little bit with Simon's first observation about the reservation. And because he wants to set it aside for the moment or for later discussion. I guess it may not be that easy to be set aside because that's something I'm working on a paper at the moment, and academically I think it's very interesting. The reason for me to say so is Simon has read you the reservation. Okay, it's talking about the executive and the legislative council. So chief executive or the head of the executive branch is not mentioned there, so that can be set aside. But then if you look at the background, the reason why at that time it was not mentioned there, it was because in 1976, when the reservation was made, we had an appointed governor in Hong Kong. So election was not an issue, simply out of the question. You can't elect. By the time 1991, we had the Bill of Rights Ordinance. At that time, the same, we had the appointed governor from the UK. So then, of course, by 1997, when China made its notification to the UN that to maintain the reservation, I guess they haven't gone into the details of it. That's my own guess. Okay. So had they known that there is a possibility that the chief executive would be elected, my personal view would be the British government or the Hong Kong colonial government at that time would certainly add that into the reservation. So the real issue is that was something the governments, neither the British government nor the Hong Kong colonial government nor the Chinese government actually thought about it. So that was something completely out of their mind at that time. So then whether we can now say so easily that because it's not there, so therefore they had the intention that the Article 25B will definitely apply in Hong Kong. I'm not that comfortable to say that argument is 100% clear to me. Yeah, that's just one point. Thanks.
Thank you.
I will start by making some preliminary observations. As an external observer, the first thing that strikes one about Hong Kong is that it can be truly proud of some aspects of its branches of government. In the first instance, I think one cannot deny the fact that judging by world standards, Hong Kong has got a very independent judiciary, one of high integrity. So I think the people of Hong Kong can be proud of the fact that they are measuring the judicial arm of government by international standards. So from the viewpoint of the external observer, the march of progress in Hong Kong must therefore be aspirational. It must therefore seek to ensure that the other branches of government now must also march in tandem with the development of an independent judiciary. It must therefore aspire to the executive arm of government also being able to be judged by global standards to be one which truly represent the wishes and the will of the people of Hong Kong. Against that observation, I also need to remark that Article 25 does not specify any particular form of government. In other words, Article 25 must be seen against the backdrop of the constitutional system of each country. So I give an example. When you measure that standard against the constitutional system of Malaysia, there you have a kingship, but not everybody can qualify to be a candidate to be king. It is under the constitutional system of Malaysia, a person who can only be elected from one of 9 hereditary rulers. And yet we cannot therefore then say that there is non-compliance with Article 25. And across the causeway into Singapore, you have a president of Singapore, the presidency of Singapore, which is elected by the people of Singapore. But then when you look at the criteria for selection, to be a candidate, you must have a certificate of eligibility given by the Presidential Election Commission. And through that operation of such a system, virtually on some occasion, the people of Singapore is given only one name to elect. Now, in my view, that sort of procedures, again, do not lend itself to measurement against international standard. So within that sort of dilemma, and I think I agree with the observation of Professor Forsyth, that the basic law of Hong Kong provides for a chief executive with a bifurcation of accountability. It is accountable not only to the people of Hong Kong, but it's also accountable to the central people's government. So in designing a system, one had to take into account the sort of constitutional settlement which has been agreed to, and how do you therefore balance that sort of agreed constitutional structure against international standard. My view is that it is a question of the people of Hong Kong advancing stage by stage towards the full attainment of international standard in the attainment of democratic values. And in order to achieve those international standards, it must be acknowledged that Article 25 does not necessarily say that a nomination procedure is precluded by the wording of Article 25. My view is that ultimately, in designing the system and accepting the fact that there is a nomination procedure, the nomination procedure, in my view, must ultimately allow a process where the people of Hong Kong can have a true and genuine choice. In other words, it must not be a nomination procedure where the people of Hong Kong are shepherded into a choice of candidates where they may not fully agree with the selection of the nominees by the nomination procedure. There must be alternative avenues to be included into the nomination procedure so that ultimately the people of Hong Kong can say, we did have a true choice, a genuine choice, and therefore that lies at the core of democratic values, which is the foundation of Article 25. And I hope that at some stage, such a procedure can be devised in order to achieve the aspirational values of the people of Hong Kong. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sorry, I don't have a written submission online. And first, let me make some general comments on the Article 25. And we all know that political rights is the first generation of human rights, so probably it's the most important human rights, one of the most important political rights. And political rights, of course, correspond to the democratic or political concept of freedom, so which enables every citizen or individuals to actively participate in the political decision-making process. And in this regard, I concur Simon's comments that Article 25 is not just about an institution of election. It's about a core value. And I agree that democracy, human rights should be upheld in implementing this article. And next, I'd like to say that Article 25 should be read in the context of the Hong Kong SAR, and precisely under the framework of the basic law. At this stage, of course, we have aspiration to achieve the ultimate goal of universal suffrage, as stated in Article 45 of the basic law. And a consensus in this regard should be reached between the sovereign and the region. And for example, this is to make any program, any solution feasible and realizable. And Article 25 does not prescribe, as Professor Lee just mentioned, does not prescribe a specific system of election to a given jurisdiction. And this opens the door for reflection or further solution. Back to, for example, back to nomination procedure. And Article 25 does not rule out any institution, the institution of civic nomination. At least some sort of civic nomination can be considered. And finally, I want to say, let us first work within the framework of basic law first. And for example, the nomination within the committee, this is my idea, nomination within the committee, or the other nomination as supplementary ones, such as civic recommendation, can be considered by the nomination committee. And in this regard, I would like to suggest a kind of reform of nomination, the current nomination committee. And again, this nomination committee, which proposed by basic law and also Annex 1 or 2 basic law. But I have, for example, in my mind, nomination could be party nomination, or parties joint nomination, and nomination by elected representatives. This is very much practiced in many other democracies. And consideration of a civic recommendation, I think this also can be considered. And
in this regard, we may have to reform the structure, the internal structure of nomination committees, such as, for example, to shrink the size of some categories, like 1, 2, 3, category 1 or 2 or 3, or expand the size of some, like the 4, category 4, in order to include more elected members or elected representatives of people. And I have a question here as well as to the article, as to the reading of Article 45 and Article 25. If you compare these two articles, you will find a difference. And we have to understand why, when writing the Article 45, drafters made this or retained this difference. This probably reflects some kind of rationale in the mind of drafters. So we have to understand whether this rationale is still sustainable, or we have to anyway understand why they write in this way. And later on, as to the concrete procedure, I will come back to that. Thank you.
Okay, Yash, how do you follow so many learned opinions and be the last guy and still have anything new to say? I'll try to see if I can do that. But some of it, I do want to agree with the points about Article 25 and the reservation. I think at the end of the day, too, the Hong Kong government should be embarrassed to argue that this reservation still applies. I mean, it's just politically, it seems silly, but at the end of the day, also, the government that emerges from saying that Article 25 doesn't apply and essentially doing what we want in Hong Kong or what they want would raise serious credibility questions, which we've seen. I mean, we see a kind of government by crisis at the moment. You know, it sort of does what I guess it thinks, not always what Beijing wants, but maybe what it thinks Beijing wants, and then gets into trouble and people go to the street and we have a crisis and then it backs off. This could only get worse in my estimation. I can't imagine how the Democratic camp in Hong Kong is going to embrace any kind of vetting of candidates. I mean, they have no incentive to do so. And the only question becomes whether Benny is going to put all these people on the street in response. But at a minimum, there's enough legislators who are simply going to reject giving the sort of veneer of democracy to someone who's no better or no different in terms of credibility than the current system. So it's kind of academic. But on the other side, I think also, when we're talking about reconciling, we do have to be mindful of the fact, if we're reconciling the basic law with ICCPR, we have to be mindful that it may not be our interpretation of the basic law. It could be Beijing's interpretation, and we may have to live with some of that. For example, the point on civil nominations, they seem to be quite adamant and have stated through multiple channels they don't think that is part of Article 45. So I suppose we'd have to do that. In many ways, the Chief Secretary, she's kind of saying, well, you guys keep talking about that, then we don't get to talk about what Article 45 really says. So I think the civil nomination promotion has been a double-edged sword. On the one side, it shows the seriousness of our community about having a genuine system. So they're promoting something that seems to stretch the fabric of Article 45 a good deal. But on the other side, I think sometimes it's allowed the government in Beijing to hide behind the basic law. So they simply say, you guys, are violating the basic law. So that's it. So we kind of get stuck there. And so I think being mindful of, is there a way to do what the Chief Secretary is inviting us to do, is to look at this Article 45 and get to something that complies with the ICCPR, even with some acceptance of whatever Beijing may be offering as an interpretation. I think another thing we may have to pay attention to, what most of us have been saying in our comments so far, is that we look at the outbound side of the nomination process and we say it has to afford free choice. It says that actually in the 1996 general comment, that the voters be given free choice. I think one thing that wasn't quite evident in the many examples dug up in the background document was almost every nomination process that was dug up there involved a party nomination in conjunction with civil nominations, which in a sense, private actors nominating. I wonder if we have to pay attention to the inbound side of the nominating committee because it is an official body. We're electing officials when we elect the nominating committee members themselves. And if that's true, what are the restraints of democratic requirements under the ICCPR when you're electing officials to a nominating body? It's like electing legislators. This nominating body under the Basic Law is not a private party. While it looks like it in some ways, it is to be an official body that will do this nominating. And under the Basic Law, it's required to be broadly representative. Okay? Now, China probably says, because the NPCSC says that we may take reference to the election committee, so there seems to be a suggestion that however it may conform to the ICCPR in its own election, the election to the nominating committee, that it should be this sectorial approach, functional sectors and so on. So the question becomes, can that be done in a way that conforms to the ICCPR? I would argue that the selection of the members of that committee should conform as well, not just because of the outcome of the committee, but because the inbound of the committee, that the committee is an official body. And then if it has to be sectoral, as that suggestion of the NPCSC suggests, then obviously you would have to look carefully at broadening the constituencies for those 4 sectors if they're going to take reference to the election committee. And again, I think mainland interpretation is going to weigh heavily on this. They're going to probably insist on that. And maybe it's a challenge to us whether we can come up using those 4 sectors with something that's acceptable. And I think we could. I think we could look at each of the sectors. For example, sectors involving corporations and finance, we could look at inclusion of more than, obviously corporate voters would be out because that wouldn't conform. Then we could look at inclusion not just of a few chief executives of companies, but also staff, shareholders, sole proprietorships. There's a whole number of ways to achieve what the ICCPR tends to require in voting is that equal voting, that the sectors be roughly equal in number. We know there's wiggle room there. Gerrymandering is one of the greatest arts of politics around the world. I've been told, I never did the counting, that actually the Republicans for the U.S. Congress House did not get as many votes as Democrats, but look, they won. So gerrymandering, I think there's wiggle room in this, but some rough sense of equality would seem to be required in that if this is an official body that's doing the nominating. And for other sectors, you can look at frontline workers, staff, homemakers. I won't say housewives, or say homemakers. And we can look at other things to see where there's equality. In the sector involving representatives of legislative bodies, we could even look at civil servants, whether they would be. So I think one route is what Johannes has put in the comments this past week in the newspaper, is to have a direct election. If that's not going to fly, if you're not going to be able to have a direct election of the nominating committee, which many of us might guess is true, then can this thing be broadened up? I don't know how much, but obviously something more than the rather narrow 250,000 voters that choose that nominating committee today. And then finally, I would say what Kelly has said is it's just not just direct discrimination, but indirect. So if you have some kind of block voting or something, it seemed to me that this whole principle of giving choice to the voters would be undermined if you say, oh, we're only going to have 4 nominees or 3 nominees, and we're going to have a block voting, and basically it's a strategy to get rid of Democrats. Now, maybe at the end of the day, all these strategies coming out of Beijing and the government shows their bottom line. And their bottom line is simply that, we're not going to have free choice in Hong Kong. If that's the case, then Benny's going to go to the street, and members of the legislature are not going to support them. But if we take them seriously, that some of their interpretations are to be taken seriously, then I think there is a lot of room for expanding the nominating committee and arguing, because the Article 25, I think there's a good argument that it still applies, the reservation is garbage, and arguing that to comply with it, the nominating committee itself has to comply in its own voting, in its own constituency and selection. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, of course.
I'll just take a moment to add to all the opinions that have been aired so far. And I'd just like to echo what Michael and Kelly have reflected on in terms of the composition of the nomination committee. A couple of issues to bear in mind when thinking about this type of sectoral representation is the extent to which we can already see in our election committee today, minority groups from particular sectors remain very, very underrepresented. And to that end, to include frontline staff and homemakers, as Michael suggested, and as Kelly said, to make sure that any nominating committee which is considered to be broadly representative, take into account the principles of equality and non-discrimination as described in the ICCPR is vital. And as an opportunity, it would be important to reflect on what is the current representation of ethnic minority or religious groups or women in the different sectors that are represented in the current election committee, if that's going to serve as the model for the nomination committee, or in the new proposed nomination committee, what room is there to expand these sectors or to add new ones to ensure that there is an enhanced level of representation? Just by way of example, currently only around 10% of the functional constituency representatives are women. There are even far fewer in terms of ethnic minority representatives. There is a grouping of religious bodies who are able to put forward their representatives, but again, you don't see any of the minority religious groups represented there either. So this is an important opportunity to consider how we can make the government more inclusive, at least if we're going to go with a nomination committee only, as opposed to the supplemental civil nomination process, then it would be even more important to ensure that due consideration is given to minority voices in Hong Kong.
Thank you very much. It's now 11:15, which is the scheduled time for coffee break. So many people probably wanted to react to the presentations, but we won't have time now. But the next session really follows from our discussion now, so that there will be opportunities to come back to many of the issues which have been put on the table. So I suggest we have a break now. I thank all the presenters for all the instructions and for highlighting critical issues that we have to address in the next session. Yes, if you can come back at 11, that would be very good. Depends how far they have to go for coffee.
Just outside.
Yes, sir. Okay. So we'll try to get back by 11.